I want to point out, as I say, that we have completely framed how we think about AI, not just generative, all wrong, that the lab is not immune to this. I don't want to pretend like you got it wrong and we got it right. We've been doing AI work since 2009, and we've made many of the same mistakes that I think we're sort of societally making today. We've been working recently with Polis on journalism AI for the last few years. We've been working with the Associated Press on local AI. I think we're getting some things right, but that collectively we're kind of getting it wrong. And what I want to talk about is that I think all too often the conversations, especially recently, about AI are a question of whether we can do what the New York Times is doing with people with machines. And the answer is kind of, right? We can kind of take a prompt that says, write a story like Maggie Haberman would about what's happening, and you'll get something that looks like what the New York Times is doing. Now, is this fair? What are the economic implications? That's kind of beside the point, I think, because this problem that we have is an Alan Turing problem. It's an Alan Turing problem because Alan Turing said, how do we know if computers are good, if computers are thoughtful, if computers are thinking, is whether or not computers can trick people. And that's not really a very useful thing for computers to do. The problem is, when Alan Turing set up this test, he made it that AI is only useful if it looks just like what we would do. And that's not really what we need. We have a system in journalism where people find facts. They find information, they craft stories, and they send those stories to people who might be interested in them, right? I mean, that's the basic model of journalism. Reporters don't always have to be writers, right? I mean, some of us know this already. There are those of you who work with video. There are some of you who work in audio or in visual mediums that aren't either of those things. But fundamentally, when we say reporter, especially in a journalism school like Medill at Northwestern, what we really mean is someone who gathers information and then writes it down. It's a very valuable skill, but it is not the only way to practice journalism. You can gather information, and you can think about taking that information and disseminating it all kinds of different ways, right? I mean, I'm not talking about the backpack journalism phase that we all went through, and hopefully we have moved beyond. But what I'm talking about is mass media is in the one-to-many business because of economics. Because of economics, and not because this is actually what people want. Even within this room, and many of us share the same interests, we don't all want the same news and information. We have different backgrounds, we have different facility with English, we have different personal interests, and yet, what we serve most people is one-to-many because of advertising, because of subscriptions, because it's easier. And to me, the promise of AI is that it lets us be one-to-one for many, because probably each of us deserve a different version of the story depending on where we are within our lives, where we are within our days, what we know about a particular topic, and how long we're willing to spend time with this information. So, I think the most important thing is that we have to stop being held hostage by the tyranny of the inverted pyramid. That we have to stop thinking about the legacy forms that were always shaped by technology. My friends at the AP claim credit, for better or for worse, for the inverted pyramid because of technology problems. Because the telegraph was unreliable, so you couldn't put the most important information later in the story. It's not even that the shape of the information matters. It's that we have forgotten who the consumer of most of the news we create. So, at the KnightLab at Northwestern, part of Medill, we think of ourselves as a community of designers, of content creators, of media people, and of technologists. And we try very hard to remember that all three phases of our identity are important. And I love how much today we have talked about the needs of the people who consume journalism. I think all too often when we spend time saying, what can generative AI do? We don't ask, what does our audience actually want? So, for example, Jojo Muska, who some of you have met, who's the lab director, he and I and Tran Ha, another colleague, are doing a big design research project around younger news consumers. And this particular person is a young news consumer in Chicago, college educated, works in a research lab actually, and was telling me about her news consumption experiences. And what she said is she gets tons of New York Times stories forwarded to her by her friends. This is a good problem to have, right? This is exactly what we want, a personal endorsement of news. She got so many of these that she had to subscribe to the New York Times because she couldn't get past the paywall another way. Great problem, right? Sounds like we've solved it. Except that when asked whether she regularly visits the New York Times, she says no. The information is too complicated. It's too intimidating. It makes her feel guilty for all the stories she has not read. Right? This is a huge problem. We're not talking about someone who the New York Times does not believe should be a subscriber. We're talking about someone who is paying, who in almost every way is an ideal New York Times subscriber who doesn't feel like the information is accessible. So potentially, what can we do about this? So this is an undergraduate project that we called Adjusting Complexity, or the Simplification Station. This is a prototype, just like Liam said. This is not a thing we're putting out in the world, but it is an idea of a thing, which is to say we can take stories from an article like the New York Times, and we can use large language models to make them easier to understand. So there are 4 levels of simplification that happen automatically when you paste in the text. We pull out the main article concepts, and we take advantage of some of the chat interface to allow people to ask questions about an article. Is this a product by itself? Not necessarily, but it's a provocation. It is the idea that we can use generative AI to make news more accessible for people who need it. I would also say, I think it's really important to say, what is personalization? Personalization, as many of you have done if you sit down with a reporter, is all about saying, what is the information that an individual might be interested in? That if you talk to a reporter, they tell you the story differently than they would write it. And that we have the ability to look at these stories and take advantage of things like first-party data. So, for example, we built Smart Context, which is a tool that looks at ongoing news stories. Here's the presidential election, and it says, we know how recently you have read a story on the New York Times about this topic. And here's all the information that you might need to know that happened in between the last story you read and the story you're reading right now. Again, large language models are really good at this kind of summarization. And they're really good at enabling, they're not good at creating news, but they're good at summarizing news. It's also important to keep in mind that almost every story has some amount of perspective, right? We want many of us to be as objective as we possibly can, but there's always going to be some amount of perspective in it. So again, we built a small system, point of view, that takes an article and allows you to play around with the perspective. So in this case, we're sort of taking a CNN article and making it sound a lot more like Fox News. And in doing so, we're actually explaining why the system is making the choices that it is. Again, a provocation. Is the end goal that we add this kind of political perspective on top of news stories? Absolutely not. But if we can do this, potentially we can also go the other way, which is to say, take biased news, identify the facts within, and change the tone. So these things are possible if we start to think about what does our audience actually want and need. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that news consumers are not usually looking for the main thing we offer, which is, at least in the text-based journalism world, a headline followed by a bunch of text. They have questions that made them seek this story, and we should be giving them answers. And if I think about something like the Washington Post, which has a search box in which I can ask a question. So if I say, how is the Ukrainian counteroffensive going? They say, here's the story about how the Pentagon and allies will train the Ukrainians to use fighter planes. Is that actually an answer to the question that I asked? No, of course it's not. But large language models can power tools like perplexity.ai, which when asked the same question, looks at journalism, lots of problems here that maybe we can solve, maybe we can't, but tries to come up with an actual answer to the question that we ask. And I guess in this case, I would say, why are we seeding to a startup the thing that we already have, which is knowledge about these topics? Why are we not answering the questions that our audience actually has? So, in closing, I would say, one, I'm super excited about the hackathon, but I want the hackathon to take place in the context of actual user needs. They could be journalistic needs. Liam explained a lot of really good needs that the newsroom has. But I would say, whatever we do, let us not seek to replicate what our human journalists already do well, but instead, let us seek to make sure that we are doing things that our human journalists cannot do, that play with scale, that play with specificity, that play with complexity, as these large language models enable us to do. Finally, I would say, there is still hope. It is true, when the New York Times wrote this article at the turn of the 1900s, the 20th century, that there was a crisis in coachmen. There were a lot of people very qualified to drive a horse and carriage. Many of them rushed out to get training to be a chauffeur. And you know what? We made it. We can together figure this out. That, to me, is the beauty of Media Party, is bringing together people with the capabilities to explore the technology in ways that actually work for the journalism. Thank you very much.